In the history of Christianity, it's often overlooked that for over 500 years, from the end of the 2nd century to the Islamic invasions, Christianity flourished in North Africa, in the lands that we know as Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. It was centered in the great city of Carthage and is associated with the great figures of Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine. It is a world that has largely vanished, but traces are still evident. We see here from Algeria a basilica from the 4th century. Or here, also from the 4th century, a basilica outside of Carthage dedicated to St. Cyprian. And we know that it was dedicated to St. Cyprian because it was mentioned by Augustine. Or later, in the 6th century, in Tunisia also, this extraordinarily beautiful baptistry. But what is the story of North African Christianity? It's reckoned that the first Christians were to be found in Africa around the year 180. That's when we have the story of 12 martyrs, 5 women and 7 men, who were facing charges of their faith and were ultimately put to death after a story of great courage that is recorded in the Acts of the Skeleton Martyrs. These martyrs, we know, were from Africa, suggesting that the movement had already taken root. The history of Christianity in North Africa is highly distinctive. It is the story of the emergence of a vibrant, highly developed culture that was multilingual and defined by a distinctive theology and church practice. It was shaped by the experience of martyrdom. The church in North Africa was deeply divided by the question of how it should respond to those who had not withstood the pressures of persecution. And in figures such as Tertullian, Perpetua, Cyprian, Augustine, the North African church produced some of the most extraordinary leaders and thinkers in the Christian world of the early church. The North African Christianity, though, had little direct contact with the apostolic period. There was no one figure, for instance, if we compare with St. Patrick later in Ireland, responsible for the conversion of the people. The roots of Christianity in Africa extend back before the martyrs of 180. But our knowledge of those earliest times is virtually non-existent. What we do know, however, is that Christianity spread quickly through the North African provinces of the Roman Empire. By the early 3rd century, there was an important presence. And that presence was both in the rural and urban areas, and it was amongst the lower classes as well as the elite. It is thought that a church was to be found in Carthage by the end of the 2nd century. It's difficult to date the arrival of the faith in Roman North Africa. But what we do know is that the center of that religion was Carthage, Rome's ancient enemy in the Punic Wars, the great city of Virgil's Aeneid. It had been rebuilt to become an extraordinarily cosmopolitan center where the culture of the Mediterranean met. African, Eastern, Western ideas, goods, languages, and customs were all exchanged. Carthage was deeply connected to Rome. It was a passage from over the sea from Carthage to Rome was relatively straightforward and frequently traversed. The African sea route to Rome was crucial in terms of trade, But Carthage was also closely connected to the other parts of the Mediterranean, to Asia Minor, and to Syria. So, in thinking about the origins of Christianity in North Africa, we have to consider how the influences were from both the East and the West. African Christianity, although it would be closely connected to Rome, was not directly influenced by Rome in its founding. Though many people came from the Italian peninsulas to plant churches in North Africa, we need to look elsewhere. In searching for the roots of African Christianity, we need to see that there were several sources. And one of the most significant was the Jewish diaspora in Africa, from which emerged many of the first Christian groups. The Jews were to be found in both the cities and in the rural areas. They lived amongst the Berber tribes, and many Jewish Christians came from the East with the diaspora of the first century. This led to immediate conflict in those communities between those who had embraced Christianity and other Jews. Along with the emergence of the Jewish diaspora and their communities was the influence of Punic culture, the local indigenous culture, and many Christians of the early period spoke Punic, a Semitic language. And the role of traditional religion in the emerging Christian communities was evident and significant. By the end of the 3rd century, Christianity had spread beyond the walls of Carthage to areas that were occupied by the nomadic tribes that lived on the edge of the Sahara. Tertullian, about whom I shall speak, wrote of how Christians spread deep into the African interior of the north. As it did, the faith was spoken in a whole range of languages and found a myriad of expressions. In Carthage itself, Christians worshipped in the open air in cemeteries where only Christians were allowed to be buried. These were located outside the walls of the city. And that great figure of the African church, Cyprian, about whom again we shall speak, was buried in a cemetery outside Carthage. And his place of burial became a center where a chapel was eventually erected. During the periods of persecution, the cemeteries remained central places of worship and gathering for Christians. But for all the engagement with other cultures, both in cosmopolitan Carthage and in the rural areas with traditional religions, Christianity faced a particular problem. And that was it sought to become the only faith, that it saw the others in terms of idolatry, and that its exclusive claims made no room for others. Those who became Christians had to withdraw from traditional practices, and this created resentment and animosity. There was a rejection of Roman public culture, such as games, festivities, and other forms of activity that distinguished Roman public life. Such an attitude meant that the Christians regarded the traditional practices of Rome and of African culture as anathema. In return, Christians themselves were suspected of being immoral and corrupt. What seemed to disturb others most were notions of secretive lives and dabbling with dark magic. Pagan opposition to Christians was often violent. Much of our knowledge of the early period of Christianity in North Africa comes from a figure who was born in Carthage around 160, the son of a centurion. Brilliant and well-educated, Tertullian remained a pagan until midlife, before converting around 197 with full zeal to the church in Carthage. He was an extraordinary voice in his age. Pugnacious as he was learned, Tertullian defined the character of the African church. He was ordained to the priesthood around the year 200, but his relationship to the church was deeply troubled. He was extraordinary in that he attacked both what he saw the laxity of the church and the corruption and immorality of the wider pagan society. In his apologies, which he wrote during the 190s, he made a militant assault on the corruption and what he saw as the irrationality of polytheistic society. Tertullian was primarily concerned with the behavior of Christians in a pagan society, how one should conduct oneself as a minority. Christians, he said, should keep themselves from all forms of idolatrous corruption. They should stay away from the entertainments. They should not serve in the military or in the civil service. Christians should live lives that in no way contributed to the idolatry of pagan society. And it was that battle with what he saw as the devil that shaped his whole perspective. Christians were locked in a struggle with a hostile society that was at root idolatrous. And he constantly advocated for a rigorous morality amongst the people. This ultimately led him to a movement known as Montanism. And that was one that emerged in the late 2nd century and was known for its adherence to what was called a new prophecy. Essentially, it held to the continuing revelation of the Spirit in the prophets. It was a prophetic movement that called for a reliance on the spontaneity of the Holy Spirit and a deeply conservative personal ethic, the kind of moral rigorism that Tertullian had been drawn to. Tertullian advocated Montanism within the church, but it soon became clear that the church would not accept this position and that it would be condemned. And as a result of this, in 207, he left the church and would remain outside of it for the rest of his life. Tertullian attacked the church for being lax in its forgiveness of serious sin, sins such as adultery, of second marriage, of conformity with pagan practices. Further, he denied the possibility of flight from persecution, which would become a crucial issue in the North African church. How should one face one's persecutors? In terms of the morality, one should mortify the body continuously to keep it from engaging in unchristian behavior. One should fast if one was to be a true follower of Christ. Although he died outside the church, Tertullian had an extraordinary influence on the development of theology and of the church in North Africa and on the wider Western tradition. He provides us with much of our knowledge of the Christian church in the early days of its development in North Africa. He tells us about its struggle with pagan society and of the decisions people made. His writings and thought bring to the fore the central issues of that culture, its struggle with moral rigorism as a defining element, the role of the Spirit, and conduct, as I say, in the face of persecution. Tertullian was brilliant, an extraordinary writer, a fighter, and a passionate believer in the faith. He was a great figure of the African church and was described by no less than Cyprian as the master.